In our last class, we discussed the various stages of ethnorelativism. We spoke about acceptance, adaptation, and integration. We also went over how these different stages interact with each other. So at this point in time, you should have a pretty clear understanding as it relates to the different stages of ethnorelativism. The key things that I want us to take away from this is when we spoke last class, we spoke about how acceptance, how it relates to the last stage of ethnocentrism, which centers on the idea that my culture, or my cultural reference, or my cultural point of view, my worldview, it's it's the most important thing, and you are only relevant based on me being able to see you, or me being able to lift your cultural identity up to be equal to mine, right? So you're valid and you're good, but that's only because I am still holding on to the essence and the importance of my own cultural identity and cultural viewpoints. In the acceptance stage, it moves a bit beyond centering my own cultural expression, my own cultural worldview, my own cultural views as the main thing that I'm matching everything against. So as it says here, right, the people in the acceptance phase, they are culturally neutral. They don't see your culture or the different culture as good or bad. They don't see your culture as only good because I can see some good in it because I also value my culture. Right? They don't make that equation of your culture is only good because I'm also viewing my culture as good. Culture across the board is neither good nor bad. It's just a thing, right? It's just culture. So this is what acceptance stage is and how it slightly differs from the minimization stage. We also discussed the adaptation phase, and where you start seeing other cultures, or the expression of, or the adoption of other cultures as valuable and as some that can add to your life. So you begin the process of taking on certain practices, worldviews, and and behaviors that you may see in cultures that may have originally been foreign to you or different from yours in particular. With this, as we said, it requires a very intentional approach, and it's not something that comes automatic. It's not something that happens at the subconscious level, but at the very conscious, intentional level. When we move on to integration, this is where we actually get into some of these behaviors and practices that come out more automatically, where we are able to engage in some of these different cultural and practices that were originally different or foreign to us, but we have now adopted them in our general interaction with others who represent that other culture. So you effortlessly and unconsciously engage in some of these behaviors or engage in some of these worldviews. And one of the examples that we used in last class is, let's say you engage in a conversation with someone who might share your cultural identity, but now they're speaking about that other cultural identity which you have integrated to a certain extent into your life or into your practices or into your worldview. And let's say that person is saying something negative about that. You might, about that other cultural position or tradition or worldview, you can actually quickly and easily jump into the frame of mind thinking like somebody from that cultural identity and now challenge what is being said, right? So you're able to do it at a psychological level, at a cognitive level is the word I want to use here, as well as at a behavioral level. So this is what integration really looks like. Moving on. So those were just summaries of the robust conversation we had on this, right? So key takeaways that I want us to leave here with, um, and an activity that you can do around it when we think of Bennett's development model of intercultural sensitivity. What stage are you on, right? So if we look at it as a continuum from ethnocentrism to ethnorelativism, look at yourself in terms of denial all the way to integration. And ask yourself, when it comes to different cultures, different practices that I see as different, where am I on the stage of it, right? And one thing that you might identify is that for different um, cultural practices or different cultural or different cultural identities, not practices, but identities, because we want to look at a whole culture as opposed to certain specific practices within that culture. But let's look at the culture as a whole. Where do you fall in that spectrum? So if I identify as somebody who is black, and I look at a different culture, at a different cultural identity, where do I fall in that? Do I see my black identity as the thing that is most valid, most valuable, most important, and the other one as something that needs to be civilized, something that needs to be brought into this space, something that needs to be modernized, right? So that might put me at the level of denial. If, however, as a black person, I see that, you know what, I see this other cultural identity doing something, um, but that actually is a threat to my own identity, then I might be at the defense stage. So I definitely don't hold them up, but I now see them as valid, and I see them as a real threat to my own cultural identity, expression, so forth and so on. So look at look at yourself along these lines, along this spectrum, and ask yourself, where do I fall? And what are some of the indicators to tell you where you fall? So for for an activity, I really would like you to take a piece of paper, um, identify yourself, identify the cultural identity that you're matching yourself against, and just say where you are on that spectrum and why you put yourself there, right? Like why you put yourself there. If you don't want to match it against a very specific other cultural identity, you can just look at it from your cultural identity and how you see other cultures in general. So it may not have to be something specific. You can actually go very general with this. And for the next class, I'll ask us to share what you came up with, right? I'll ask for some folks to share. All of the things that we have spoken about before, when we started the class, really come through different social and cultural institutions, right? We learn culture, as we spoke of in the first week. We learn culture through many different social and cultural institutions. Many of you mentioned family, school, government, whatever have you, right? Or church, religion, all of these things are social and cultural institutions that allow us to form our cultural identity. So what are some of the general rules of these social institutions? They help individuals structure how they navigate their own identity. They help individuals structure their practices. They help individuals even structure their thought patterns around certain phenomena. So this is the way in which individuals get a sense of what is normal or normative for them. Right? This is how they develop the normative character that they have within the broader spectrum of people who engage and who identify with that particular cultural identity. So institutions on the whole, they help regulate the behavior of individuals in certain specific areas of society. So we'll just go over a couple of them really quickly, right? Family and other relationship networks, extended family, close friends, close friendships, they help us identify and navigate or engage in social reproduction and socialization with others. So they establish norms for what this look like. They establish practices in which we engage for this, and things that deviate from that will cause us to be othered as we start thinking about it some more. Any institution that falls within the realm of education and training, they ensure this transmission and cultivation of knowledge. So just like we are doing here in a university setting, right? This is a very specific cultural institution that transmits learning and knowledge and the continuation of our intellectual capacities and our intellectual thinking and practices in a very specific way, right? You come to class, you get a grade, you graduate, and hopefully you get a job, right? But when you look at what happens around the nation, right, when it comes to colleges and universities, it's more or less the same thing. So any institution in the realm of education and training, it really is centered on the transmission and cultivation of knowledge abilities and all of the skills and behaviors and practices that we think as this cultural identity that we think are important for people who come after us. And that is why these cultural institutions continue to do things in a very specific way. Anything that focuses on the workforce, employment, labor, they're centered on how do we go about producing goods and services or reproducing goods and services. So, and as you can see, they're very tied. Each of these, right, it's very tied to other types of institutions on this list here. So think of a career of your parent or your own career or your own jobs and stuff like that. What are some of the things that they teach? What are some of the things that they reinforce? What are some of the things that they tell you? So if we want to link education to the job market or the labor market, you go to school, you learn what, you do your work well, you come out successful, and you should be able to get a job. If you get that job and you work well at it, you should be able to progress or ascend to different levels in that career. And once you ascend to different levels in that career, it will increase the amount of resources that you have. It will increase your income. And therefore, once it increases your income, you will be able to change your way of life, your code of life, your lifestyle, right? Not code of life, but your lifestyle or your level of comfort in life. All of these things get reinforced through these cultural and social institutions. So we have the note here that social and cultural institutions like family provide us with the first understanding, and I'm reading this so that it sort of like registers, right? Provides us with the first understanding of the difference between races, whether implicitly or explicitly, and the conflict of other gets ingrained there. There's tons of work out there that illustrate where we first get our encounters with race, right? That the family and other educational institutions primarily really help us engage with race, right? That's our first encounter with race. Other social institutions that are not mentioned here absolutely do that, and you can go ahead and think about some of these, and let's share some of these when we come to class next time. The fourth point here about institutions in the realm of law, governance, and politics really are concerned with social order. We've had a number of different statements that come out of this, that have come out of this realm in the past, right? Like the war on drugs. It's a very, very focused and heavy statement to make in terms of how we are going to deal with the drug epidemic of the 80s and 90s, right? Of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Very different from not using the war terminology for the opioid epidemic or health crisis, but really refer to it as the opioid health crisis or the opioid epidemic. This is the language that comes out of law, governance, and politics. So it tells us how we should deal with these types of phenomena in our society. So 30 years ago, the way you dealt with somebody who was an addict was you saw them as a threat, reported them, had them locked up. The way we deal with that now, see it as a health crisis, probably even a mental health crisis, a mental health issue. And so what they need is a different type of support. They don't need punishment, but they need support to move out of that condition. All of these things influence how we look and deal and engage in these various phenomena that we see outside in society. So what we get from the government, for example, if we say we are re-establishing law and order around this time of social unrest when it comes to anti-blackness and racism, and the fight against that, the fight against various forms of discrimination, when we hear terms like law and order, it sends a very clear message as to what the focus is or what the approach is to navigate this particular phenomenon. So this is how we learn. This is how we develop our own language around it, either in line with what is coming out of these institutions or as a counter to it, right? So the institutions help us figure out how to think around various types of phenomena and what we see as normative. So if we see somebody who has a view that protests are negative, that protests are a destabilizing of law and order, this is a behavior or this is a thinking that they have adopted based on this particular cultural institution. Media, religious institutions, all of these things help give us meaning to the various contexts and values and ideas that we have coming out of some of the previous institutions mentioned. So different symbolic codes, different ways in which we engage, ways in which we speak about phenomena, ways in which we communicate with each other, ways in which we think about a lot of these things that I mentioned previously. The fifth group there, right? Cultural, media, and religious institutions all play a hand in how that gets shaped. When we think of cross-cultural conflict occurring between individuals or social groups, we have to understand that there are socially created boundaries that are causing us to see these differences and amplify these differences in ways that create conflict. When we move in, this definition of intercultural conflict there is a repeat of a definition that was there, but it's a transition to what we're going to next, right? When we start talking about the social barriers that get constructed, and some of these social barriers that get constructed actually start off as psychological, as cognitive or psychological ways in which we think of the other and ways in which we engage of the other, ways in which we engage the other. So in the next video, we're going to talk about things like intractable conflict and what that looks like when it comes to intercultural conflict, or the coordinated management of meaning theory, right? When it comes to intercultural conflict. So we're going to go into that in the next lesson that I'm going to share with you. So this definition that you're looking at here about intercultural conflict and about cross-cultural conflict and how they center on these social barriers that we have there, or people of dissimilar cultures who see each other as different, and how that relates or how that creates conflict and how that conflict can escalate, and different ways in which we can manage that conflict are things that we're going to continue to move into. So summary, this is just to wrap up some of the theories or the concepts that I want us to keep in mind as we're thinking about intercultural conflict and cross-cultural conflict moving forward.